Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our first of a series of webinars called Route to the Top. With me today, I have David Sole, who is the managing partner of School for CEOs, and I also have Sandy Manson, who has got a long history behind him being an accountant. He is a chartered accountant, and for the past 10 years, he has been CEO of Johnston Carmichael. Johnston Carmichael is Scotland's largest firm of chartered accountants. Now, when he has spare time, he also is the Deputy President of ICAST, which is the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland. So very knowledgeable men sitting in front of me today to help us figure out how CFOs can really transform themselves, and take on that next job of CEO. What's the difference between the two? This series is actually a part of a larger series where we're really going to be talking about different types of people that go into that role of CEO, including people in marketing, people within technology, people within the HR. But today we're focusing specifically on that CFO process, as it is one of the more commonly used processes to getting into CEO. So without further ado, David, Sandy, welcome very much to the webinar, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks, Catherine, and Sandy, thank you so much for
very welcome
joining me. I think if we could maybe move to the next slide. There are two or three things that we'd like to touch on today. I think one is what gives the CFO a particular advantage in that transition to CEO, and then secondly, what are the things that they need to look out for? What are the derailers? And finally, what are the differences that you encounter between public, private and family-owned businesses? And we'll perhaps touch on your own experiences as CEO of partnership, which again is another interesting dynamic. But if we could move on to the slides. We did a piece of research back in 2013 where we were asking a number of CEOs and chairmen about the challenges of transitioning to the top of an organization. And we discovered that 40% of them had a background in finance. Now, the specialist recruiters, Robert Half UK, did another piece. They did an annual piece of research, and they discovered that 43% of the FTSE 100 CEOs had a background in finance. Interestingly, down from 55% last year, and 19% of those, or almost half, were chartered accountants. So Sandy, what gives a chartered accountant the advantage?
Well, I mean, thank you, David. Interesting percentages, and I do think if you looked back at the percentage of CFOs who moved into CEO after 2008, I think it begins to answer one of your questions. And I think if you looked at the statistics, you would see that it was a higher percentage after the banking crisis, after the financial crisis, because one of the qualities which I think CFOs bring as potential CEOs is they're trusted. And they're really trusted with the stewardship of businesses. And given the banking crisis, it became an economic crisis, I think the time was fertile for CFOs and their skill sets to really come to the fore. So trust, I think, is very important. The influence of the financial markets plays into that. The advent and the growth of private equity, again, investors are looking for more than just a safe pair of hands, because I think to be a CEO, you've got to be more than a safe pair of hands. But a CFO's skill set gives markets, investors, I believe, a lot of confidence. But I think that one of the more critical qualities that CFOs bring to being CEOs is in their time as CFO. The CFO is involved in almost every major decision in the business. That means that commercially, they get a huge insight, David, to what's going on. The experience that gives them. I mean, a CFO will not only know how to measure profit, which I hope they do so well. Being chartered accountants, they will do so brilliantly. But actually, I believe they will understand how to make a profit. And so that commercial insight you get as a CFO stands you in very good stead. It's not, I would argue, enough, but it puts you in very good stead.
That point about making a profit is an interesting one, because I think what we find very often is that transition from CFO to CEO is sometimes limited because CFOs are great keeping the score, but not necessarily great at scoring the goals, or I should say, haven't had the experience in scoring the goals. And so that P&L accountability is very often a gap in their experience, which needs to be plugged somehow.
Well, I'm going to challenge you on that, David, because I have to say, I think times have moved on. I mean, the old adage, the insult of you're a number cruncher, you're a chartered accountant, times have moved on from that, and I'll tell you why I think that is so. We live in a world today of big data. Data is not everything, but it's a critical part of our dimensions in a business. The interpretation, well, the collation, the interpretation of data plays right into the skill set of a CFO. So in this world of big data, a CFO, I believe, gets all that. They're so well positioned. And that, too, I think, gives them an edge when it comes to, if you like, graduating to be a CEO.
One of the things that we've noticed is that it's harder to find those opportunities to get P&L responsibility, the way organizations are structured now. And yet, you know, we touched on the leadership aspect of it. When you think about the leadership aspect of the role of the CEO, how well does a CFO measure up to that in that transition?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because, you know, back to the old adage of, you know, number cruncher and so on. A CFO, to really become a CEO, I believe, needs to demonstrate the leadership qualities, because you hit the nail on the head, David, in terms of it's that, you know, I can measure profit, I can understand profit, I'm a really good CFO, but to become a CEO, you do need to understand and progress into leadership. Now, I would argue, in many ways, CFOs are leaders. They lead a team. They need to understand EQ, emotional intelligence. They lead finance teams. I was talking last night at a dinner to a former CEO who was the former CFO of a major Scottish PLC. And he said his pretty iconic boss, who was then the CEO and this gentleman was CFO, gave him tests, gave him trials of giving him parts of the group to run. And that was almost training him, trialing him to become a CEO, which of course he went on to become. And that kind of opportunity to translate his CFO skills into leadership while still a CFO, I think was quite critical.
I'd agree with that. And I think that's such an integral part of development. We talk a lot on our programs about how do you get those experiences. If your ultimate aspiration is to run a business and to lead a business, but your functional expertise is in finance or indeed in marketing or sales or HR or whatever it is, how do you get those experiences? And I think you've got to be quite enlightened as an organization to take the risk on someone and say, you know, go and run that part of the business for us.
Yeah, I mean, my own experience, because I was brought up as an auditor, and you know, you might think, how can an auditor translate into a CEO? And I had no formal training of being a CEO, and I've been a CEO for 10 years now. But I think one of the best bits of advice I received was that to be, or when you are a CFO, you've got to think like a CEO. And I do think that being a CFO, you're so well positioned, almost like number two in the business, dare I say. You're like number two. And when you're shadowing, and as accountants, we're maybe more the introverts, we're maybe more analytical, and I think that plays quite well. Typically I see, and I'm generalizing as one probably has to, that the CFOs don't come in with this big ego. I think in the boardroom that's well received. That they come in with a lot of knowledge of the business. They come in, they've kind of done their time, they've understudied the CEO, and I think that's why they're very well placed.
What about the external side of things? I think one of the advantages that many people, certainly in public companies, talk about the CEO is that they have a distinct advantage in terms of relationships with the city, with investors, with brokers, and so on and so forth. Do you think that is as big an advantage as it's made out to be?
Absolutely. I do think when you talk to the investor community, they are looking for, as I say, more than a safe pair of hands, but it's about people they trust, people who understand the dynamics, and actually people who are not going to give them surprises. I do think the CFO is very well positioned not to give their shareholders, their investors surprises, because I do tend to think their hands or their fingers are all in the pulse.
Mm-hmm. One final question on the sort of CFO CEO transition. I mean, the diversity agenda is very much in the news at the moment. Do you think that the finance function has an opportunity to play a really compelling part in that, given, you know, when you consider the number of women coming into finance jobs in some of the big four accountancy firms and into finance jobs into other organisations? Do you think that has an opportunity to really play into that and, you know, increase the number of female CEOs that we have in our organisations across the UK now?
Short answer, yes. Because I look at our own business and the gender mix, and you know, as an employer, we're trying to be ever more flexible. And this is one of the big boardroom issues just now, is obtaining more diversity. I have to say, diversity is not just about gender diversity. I mean, diversity, in my experience, around a boardroom comes from diversity of thinking. I mean, we can debate psychometric tests, but, you know, I remember getting my own psychometric test, David, going back to my wife saying, please tell me this isn't me. And she assured me that was spot on. But getting people who think differently around that boardroom table, regardless of gender, regardless of experience, and CFOs too, we're not all blue analytical number crunching types. CFOs too can be quite diverse. Mm-hmm. So I do think it is another way to try and encourage greater diversity.
I absolutely agree with that. You know, the diversity of thought is the most critical piece, and that comes, if that package is in gender or race or ethnicity or whatever, then, you know, that's got to be a really important thing. And
if I could just make one final point, as I think, David, going back to your point about the city and investors, and I include private equity, it is that CFOs have this very intangible thing, and again, typically, they have a nose for risk. Mm-hmm. Risk is, you know, it's something we all live with daily in terms of our businesses. CFOs tend to be pretty good bloodhounds, watchdogs when it comes to risk. Mm. So I think that's another quality.
I mean, our view is that CEO-CFO relationship is really critical in organisations, and the CEO should be the optimist and eternally the optimist, and the CFO should be eternally the pessimist, which must make an interesting transition if you've made that transition from being private Fraser, we're all doomed, to suddenly being relentlessly positive about the possibilities for the business and the organisation. And is that a difficult transition, do you think, for people to manage, you know, notwithstanding that nose for risk?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting point. And having made that transition myself, I would let others judge whether successfully or not. But, you know, we're taught and brought up, and I'm an auditor, to be challenging, to seek evidence. Decision-making must be evidential. Mm. But when you become a CEO, the world changes quite dramatically. That now I've got, my role, I would argue, is summed up in 3 words: to energize, to excite, and to enthuse the organization. Now, you might say, did they teach you that when you were a chartered accountant? Well, I mean, I would argue as a CA, it's a great business qualification, not just an accountancy qualification. But as a CFO becoming a CEO, I don't think we all need to be, you know, Mahatma Gandhi or JFK, but we do need to be inspirers. We need to energize our organizations. So it's a very interesting question of how does one really do that?
Yeah. And I've met a few CEOs in my time who might struggle with that. Catherine, are there any questions that have come through from the audience that we might want to put to Sandy before we move on to some of the derailers?
Yeah, we've had one really interesting question that's come up that goes back to, your first slide here about these interesting numbers of 40% in the past having financial backgrounds, but that number seems to have decreased a little bit. So will accountants in the future still have this advantage over non-accountants when it comes to taking on this top position, or do you see that likely to change?
My view in that, Catherine, is I think more opportunities than ever before. I mean, I note the dip. It slightly surprises me, the dip, but I think it may be a statistical, you said, being a chartered accountant, fact from 2008, as I said earlier. I think CFOs really propelled themselves into CEO positions. I think there's some fundamental factors at play here which will encourage more CFOs to be CEOs. And that is the big data, the way technology is reshaping the way we do business. The CFO's insight and commercial insight and the advent of more capital in the markets and the advent of private equity, my view, I think the CFO is better positioned than ever to become a CEO. I think that trend is going to continue.
I absolutely share some of the points that you touched on, Sandy, particularly in the big data and artificial intelligence and the application of that. I think CEOs will need to have a strong technical literacy going forward and how they understand the impact of technology on their businesses, but also how they horizon scan for potential disruptors to their business model as they come in. So I think that is going to be an increasing skill, certainly in the next little while.
And I think one final point on that, Catherine, I think there are certain industries where it can be more challenging for the CFO to become a CEO. Perhaps it might be an engineering-dominated industry or technology. That's not to say a CFO can't become a CEO, but in my experience, some of those industries, you do tend to see the engineers there, say the technical chaps and men and women becoming CEOs.
Are there any other questions, Catherine, before we move on to derailers?
No, at this time, I think we should move on to the derailers for CFOs and see what you have to say on that topic.
Great, thanks. If we can move on to the slide. In your view, Sandy, what are the key things that CFOs need to watch out for if they've made that transition, they've got the role, the top job in the organisation? What are the things that they need to be watching out for?
Well, I would relate to my own experience, David, which is being a CA, I became CEO and I love the numbers. I love the management accounts. I love the annual accounts. And of course, you've got to completely divorce yourself from that because you need in turn to have a great CFO in place. So it is the development of what makes a good CEO. And I don't think you can put this into any bottle because I think CEOs come in all shapes and forms. And I'm a great believer in authenticity, that to be a great CEO, you've just got to be authentic. But I come back to this: excite, energize, and enthuse the organization. So the big derailer, I think, for anyone, whether it's a CFO or head of marketing or head of HR becoming a CEO, is what are they going to do with the business? What is their vision? They've got to become such a strong strategist. They have to become an inspirer. They have to get this business together. They've got to win the hearts and minds of their people, of their stakeholders. That can be quite hard if you're really thinking only of numbers. And a good CFO, I would argue, has had such a good commercial training. If there's one thing that distinguishes, in my mind, a good CFO becoming a good CEO from those who are not so good, it is commercial insight. A good CFO has had a great opportunity to gain commercial insight to their business. If you can then translate that successfully into becoming a CEO, much lower risk of derailing. So what are the other things that can potentially derail a CFO becoming a CEO in my experience? It's back to relationships. I'm, as I say, an auditor, but when I became CEO, I could see the importance, again, of winning hearts and minds by building relationships. I had relationships in our business. I think CFOs, of course, have got relationships. But it's actually to get under the skin, to inspire people, win their hearts and minds, can be a challenge typically for those of us who are brought up, being wizards with debits and credits.
I absolutely agree with that. I worked with a CFO who transitioned to CEO, and his chairman said one of the biggest challenges is this particular individual loves being in the numbers. But to his absolute credit, he hired a fantastic CFO to replace him, who he trusted implicitly, and has let him get on with it. And that relationship has thrived as a consequence of that. And I kind of wondered if that CEO-CFO relationship is quite key. Is that an advantage or a disadvantage? If you've been there, done the job, and you then have to forge that I mean, you talked a lot about relationships, and I'd absolutely agree that those are key to being derailers. Is that, how do you do that from a CFO to CEO?
Well, it's pretty daunting, if you are the new CFO and your new CEO was your predecessor, because you better get your numbers right. But actually, what it does give is a lot of empathy. I mean, you understand the CFO. Hopefully, you will not have to worry about this new CFO because you'll have chosen him or her, and they will be absolutely what you want. So I think that relationship will get off because I think the new CEO will have ideally chosen their successor.
Yeah.
But you're right, there are challenges there, David, because you must not try and do your old job, and you've got to work as a team. But your CFO relationship, is it any more important than your head of marketing, your head of production, your head of IT?
Yeah.
It is one of many relationships as the new CEO you've got to build.
And that brings on to an interesting point. Is a derailer the pace at which you might want to make changes to your team? So, you've inherited a team, particularly if you've been an internal candidate from CFO to CEO. How quickly do you do that? What changes do you make? Where do you go first?
Again, I'm trying to be objective on the qualities, but I'm a great fan of CFOs because CFOs have had a
it's
really
impossible.
It's a great business education being a CFO. Let's just talk about that. It's like business education. It is a business experience. So what I think that's typically going to give you is that critical, I would argue, 100 days. You are the new CEO. You've got to get it right. You've got to put your mark down. And typically I would find and argue that CFOs they will assess, they will measure before they act. They're not going to do things typically out of ego-driven desires. They will do things based on what is right for the business. And so they will have, in my experience, a 100-day plan. They will structure it. They will gather the evidence. They will consult the team, and they'll pull together, I think, a very well thought out plan.
I think for me, we're absolutely at the heart of some of the derailers because on the one hand, you want to be consultative, but on the other hand, people are looking for you to give direction. And so how do you balance that? On the one hand, you want to act quickly and make a mark, but on the other hand, if you act too quickly, you can be seen as being too impulsive. And so these judgments, I think, are really critical. And whether it's a CFO or HR director or whoever it is coming, some of those are consistent derailers, and it's very difficult to manage. That piece about judgment is interesting. How do you know when you've got enough data and information to make a decision, and how comfortable, particularly if you come from a very analytical background, are you with making a decision if you've only got 80% of the information?
Just on judgment, I'm going to tell you a little story, David. When I was first appointed as CEO of Johnston Carmichael, I was at a conference in America. And a wonderful man called Carl Barranco, he ran a big accounting firm in Mississippi. And he came up to me in Mississippi and Alabama, and he came up and said, "Sandy, I hear you've just been appointed CEO of Johnston Carmichael." And he asked me, "How many people do you employ?" And then we employed 300 people. And he paused for a minute, and then he turned to me and he said, 300 people, and you've just become CEO. You do realize, he said, that 300 families depend on your judgment. And it was quite a sobering thought that having become CEO, that judgment that you make, the impact of it, this isn't a game. This is serious. And I do think that CFO background, it is not enough because you must go and make your mark. You've got to bring a business and take it to a different level. And Sir Brian Souter, who's president of ICAS, says you've got to get the mechanics of your business right, but equally the dynamics of your business. And whereas with my own background, I was pretty good at the mechanics, we have to help develop, I think, instinctively those dynamics, vision, energy, insight, inspiration.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think that some of the messages and the research we did back in 2013 was those aspects need to be communicated right from CEO to C-suite, not only to the direct team, but right to the shop floor. So it's the classic NASA story. JFK said, we're going to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth. And when you were asking the janitor at Cape Canaveral what he was there to do, he was there to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth. Everybody got it.
But that was inspiration, and that was, a vision.
And communication,
yes.
So that everybody recognized that's what their purpose
things, for example, as a new CEO, what did? I did town hall meetings. I set our vision, I set our strategy, I furiously went around our firm communicating that strategy. These were things that probably didn't come naturally, but I had to develop from coming from a kind of CFO accounting background. Can I talk about another derailer, David, just as I think about this, potential derailer? And just excuse us, but this is almost like the rugby analogy, because I remember being a Gordonian, talking to one of my colleagues when Gordonians went, it's a rugby club in Scotland, the northeast of Scotland, went from Division 2 to Division 1. And this friend of mine said, the biggest difference between Division 2 and Division 1 was the pace the game is played at. When you become a CEO, the pace of business and the things and the angles and the dimensions, it is a pretty furious pace. And that's the other thing that I think a new CEO has to adjust to. It's that pace of play.
Yeah. Catherine, are there any questions to Sandy on derailers?
Yep, we've had a couple of questions come through. The first one that I want to ask is how critical is that relationship between the CFO or CEO or the new CEO, if they were previous CFO, and the chairman? What are your thoughts on that?
The CFO and the chairman?
Yes.
CEO.
Or the new CEO. So the CFO or now new CEO and the chairman.
Critical. And why I think that's critical is it's one of many relationships. But the chairman is the conductor of this orchestra, the board. And when you're a chairman, your job, to my mind, is to clearly support your CEO, but challenge the CEO. My own view is, Catherine, one can't get too close to the CEO. You need to understand and build and support. But you, as a chairman, I'm afraid, might be the one firing that CEO. So the relationship's important because I think it's almost I could make this message of government as well as a boardroom. But you need to be aligned. And at boardroom level, there needs to be alignment between what the directors and the board expect and what the CEO is delivering. So it's a critical relationship. So I think it comes back to communication, it comes back to regular dialogue. But above all else, if I'm the CEO and I have a chairman, I'm accountable to the board and I'm accountable to the chairman.
And I guess our view is that the CEO is there to run the business and the chairman is there to run the board. But you're absolutely right, that relationship is key because at some point if the business is going southwards, then it's the chairman who has to step in and fire the CEO. So, yeah.
And I'll be so bold as to suggest, we don't have those statistics in front of us, but they might be quite interesting, how many CFOs go on to become chairman?
Yeah.
And I think you might be surprised, we might all be surprised how many do, because I think it's not, in many ways, I think CFO historically was seen as being the summit. Actually, it's a stepping stone, I think, to becoming a CEO and another stepping stone to becoming chairman.
Yeah.
Actually, that was one of the other questions that came through when you were mentioning how CFOs were more risk averse, and somebody was asking, does that make them actually better chairmen in the boardroom, being more the risk averse side of the decision making process?
In many ways, it does, because I think, again, and I'm generalizing, but CFOs, in my experience, they tend not to be too egocentric, which makes them perfect chairman. Because a chairman's got to be in there conducting that orchestra and being able to build good relationships. So I think being risk averse, having a nose for risk in this day and age, I think is one of the great qualities of not just a CFO or a CEO or a non-executive director. It's, there is risk, and we've lived through 2008. We're living through a world of cybersecurity risk. Having that a nose for risk is a critical quality.
Anything else, Catherine, or shall we move on to public, private, and family?
We have a couple more, but let's move on and take those to the end of the webinar.
Okay. So, differences between
I mean, obviously big differences, because in the world of PLCs, or private equity-backed businesses, David, investor relations are critical. Reputation management. I mean, we can all think of some pretty high-profile names in the PLC world in recent years where there have been scandals. And so when you are CFO going CEO in a PLC, investor relations, reputation, a bit like the governor of the Bank of England. Anything you say and say in public, you've got to be so careful. Yeah. So governance is one of the most tangible differences. You have a very and much stricter governance regime, very codified. Cadbury, Smith, Murray, Higgs, and so it goes on. Yeah. What I do see is in the private company world, governance is rightly becoming much more to the fore. Why is that? Because it's actually good for your business. It's good, companies are increasingly aware that they have a responsibility to society, private or public. And I think private company governance too is increasingly important. So being a CEO in a private company, typically it means you are going to face certain challenges you will not face actually in a PLC. I'll give you a case in point. A lot of private companies may have been founded by, because this could be a family business, multi-generational, and you'll find that the chairman could well be, second, third, fourth generation. These are my toys, and I'm going to potentially play with them. This is my business, and understandable. So as a CEO, one has to understand those dynamics, and it can be challenging, but equally very rewarding, because in a private company environment as a CEO, you are much more the conciliary. The owners, the family are looking to you to help, and they clearly feel passionately and care passionately about the business. So, and finally, in public sector, for example, public sector companies, that is a very different ballgame in my experience. I mean, in terms of CIPFA and being Institute of Chartered Accountants, we work closely with CIPFA. I had a meeting with CIPFA last week, and talking to them about the challenges of being a CFO in the public sector. Very, very interesting. You are managing and leading in times of cut. That's a challenge. Yeah.
I'll put you on the spot, Sandy. If you were to be the CEO of, or you had your choice of a FTSE business listed on the stock exchange or a private equity-backed business, without that scrutiny, or a family business with let's say a slightly feisty family, which would you pick and why?
Well,
given your background in finance.
So, being brought up in a small family business in the northeast of Scotland, I mean, the family business environment I understand on so well, and I love it. We work with many wonderful family and private businesses, and there are great opportunities because you are helping provide the owners of these businesses with commercial insight. It's very rewarding. You feel you are a bigger cog in the smaller wheel. It has attractions. Now, I've been there. I'm doing that. I'm still learning about that, and I'm constantly learning. But I equally, I would love to have the challenge of the PLC world, because I can see not only with the governance, but with the opportunity and with the funding and the opportunities to take that and to replicate. I mean, I would not underestimate the skills that a private company CFO, CEO has honed, and how I think those could translate well into a public company sector. Because they are, in my experience, very commercial people who are coming from the private sector. They've seen all dimensions, and those can translate well. So I think it's horses for courses. I'm not avoiding your question at all, David, because I see attractions in them all.
Yeah.
And But I do have a hankering if there was ever an opportunity, because I've not really worked in that world supposedly.
We haven't talked about partnerships per se, obviously, and you are the CEO of a partnership. What dynamics does that offer? The leadership, or what is the leadership challenge from that perspective?
Well, I'm not sure how many people who are watching are involved in professional services, but the professional services industry, whether they're lawyers, investment bankers, accountants, I think there are particular nuances of leading in that environment, because you're leading, people with very high cognitive skills. And I think, David, you told me years ago about the right-hand side of the brain being very creative and the left-hand side being the analytical bit. But you have to really use your right-hand side of your brain in leading a professional services firm, because these are very smart people, and they're looking at you, and they'll have offers, they'll have headhunters on the phone, and they're looking at you saying, you need to give me a future that I believe in. You need to inspire me that I can build on that.
Back to that vision that you talked about so eloquently, Sandy. Sandy, one more question before we go to the questions from the floor. If there were young members of ICAS watching today, and you would say, here are 2 or 3 key bits of advice that I would offer you in your career if you want to make that transition from CFO to CEO, what are those 1, 2, or 3 bits of advice that you would give them?
I think firstly it is to be commercial, to understand how a business operates. I mean, we're brought up to be top debits and credits and how to prepare accounts and do wonderful things with accounts. But as a CA, we're much more than that. We're actually, I would argue, it's a business qualification. So try and understand how business is generated. Sir David Tweedy, who's former ICAS president, tells a story of when he was a young trainee in Govan doing a job, and this manufacturing company had 2 basic production lines. One was the high volume, low margin, and the other one was the low volume, high margin. And he explained that the company made 90% of its profit from, guess what, the low volume, high margin unit. And he said to his manager, you should tell the chief executive this. And his audit manager said to him, that's not our job. So that resonates. Yeah. What else would I say? Keep learning, have a growth mindset. Try and talk to people, absorb information, attend conferences, pick up. I mean, working with Sir Brian Souter, what a successful man, what a fascinating brain, and learning from people like that. I've been lucky to do that. So I think young and aspiring CAs, I think it is about your network. It is about being commercial, and it is, I think, about this constant process of growing yourself.
Yeah. Very sort of valid qualities, irrespective of whether you're a CEO or not. I think absolutely relevant. Catherine, have you got some questions from our audience for Sandy in the last 5 minutes or so of the webinar?
Yes, we do. We have quite a few little questions, so I'll go through what we have time to get through. One of the things, Sandy, that's been picked up upon was how you mentioned that CFOs weren't really traditionally egocentric. So how do they handle suddenly being in the spotlight and having everyone ask questions, and that kind of, CEOs are thought of sort of needing egos in a way. So how would you see that transition?
Well, we all have egos. It's a question of whether we suppress them or not. But you're right. Typically, we are, and I'm using colors through the psychometric test, but we're blue, we're analytical, we're evidential, and therefore, I think we need to be authentic. We cannot reinvent ourselves. We cannot change who we are. So I think that's the first thing. But how we inspire people can be done in different ways. I don't think we all need to be the JFKs and the Nelson Mandelas. I think we can use our own ability, our own qualities to inspire people. So I don't think we need to develop an ego. I think I would try and keep that suppressed. I think what we do need to develop is an ability to inspire people, to energize organizations, to set compelling vision. The one derailer we didn't talk about in vision is, I think it was Helmut von Moltke, the Prussian general, when he said, a strategy only survives the first engagement with the enemy. So, and so I really think we need to be fleet of foot, we need to be agile, but I don't think we need to be egocentric.
Okay, excellent. Good to know. So keep those egos out of the boardroom a little bit more. The other question we have is about marketing. So if CFOs don't really have that marketing creativity that traditionally maybe other departments have, how does that impact their ability to be the CEO and be that sort of creative force that's taking the company forward?
I think, Catherine, being a leader does not mean we need to know all the answers. Being a leader means we simply need to make judgments and employ people who can give us the answers. One of the most out of comfort zone experiences I have had as a CEO has been the rebranding of our business. I mean, really, for a chartered accountant, I'm sorry, I don't do branding, but I kind of knew when it was going to be right. And we employed an incredible marketing director who is still very much a key part of our team. And she guided us through this process and still does so. And so my point is, in areas, they might be technology or they might be marketing, what we need to do is surround ourselves with really able people.
So sort of summing it all up, what in both of your opinions is the top challenge that CFOs should be aware of and should be preparing themselves to support themselves with other people, or what should they really be looking out for? What's their top challenge becoming CEO?
I think it's a really good question, and you're drawn to a wide variety of answers. So picking one is really, really challenging. I mean, I echo some of the points that Sandy made around vision. So having a real clear sense of purpose. What's the why of people coming to work in your organization? And if you can articulate that really clearly, really simply, really memorably, and right the way through the organization, I think that for me is one of the key challenges. Not just for CFOs, but for any leader making that transition into the top role. Articulating what's the why of why do we come to work? What's the purpose?
I think my answer, and I totally agree with David, because that's really powerful stuff. But I think CEOs are not born, they're made. And I think as a CFO, you've got to think like a CEO. And so that would be my one piece of advice. As a CFO, think like a CEO and immerse yourself in the business. Understand all the different dynamics of the business.
Excellent. Well, thank you, guys. I'm very conscious that we've run out of time. But as you can see, we've gone through really what it takes to become a CEO from a CFO, what derailers people should be looking out for, and then how CFOs can really relate to the different sides of the business depending on if they're private or family owned. So thank you very much for both of your time today. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first of a series of webinars that School for CEOs is going to be hosting on how to get to that top position of CEO. While traditionally it is through the CFO route or accounting route, which we now understand why. There's lots of positives behind that education. There are other ways, such as marketing, HR, or the scary technology that is coming down in the future. So I do hope you're able to join us in the future for some of our other webinars. Plus, please feel free to get in touch with David or Sandy if your questions weren't answered. I'm sorry that we run out of time to answer all of them, and I'm sure they'd be happy to get back in touch with you. Again, Sandy, David, thank you for your time, and thank you everyone else for attending this afternoon.